Welcome to Strange Planet. For decades, we've been told Antarctica is nothing more than ice, penguins, and climate models. A frozen wasteland reserved for peaceful science. That story doesn't hold. Tonight's guest has been to the bottom of the world, and what he uncovered suggests Antarctica may be the most censored, strategically protected, and consequential landmass on Earth. Brad Olsen is an explorer, researcher, and author of Secrets of Antarctica, The Untold History of the Ice Continent, a book that pulls together suppressed military history, ancient maps that shouldn't exist, Nazi expeditions that never truly ended, unexplained no-fly zones, buried pyramids, UFO encounters, and whispers of advanced civilizations sealed beneath miles of ice. This isn't armchair speculation. Brad self-financed a perilous expedition to Antarctica back in 2019, crossing the infamous Drake Passage by sailboat, speaking directly with research station personnel and investigating firsthand the anomalies the public is never meant to ask about, let alone see. His work traces a hidden continuity from ice-free prehistoric Antarctica to Admiral Byrd's aborted Operation Highjump, to secret treaties, underground bases, breakaway technology, and a global elite quietly converging on the South Pole. Brad is the author of the Esoteric Series, including Modern Esoteric, Future Esoteric, and Beyond Esoteric, and is widely regarded as one of the most fearless researchers mapping the intersection of forbidden history, suppressed science, and geopolitical secrecy. Tonight, we're going to ask the question most institutions refuse to touch. What is really going on in Antarctica, and why is it so important that we don't know? Brad, welcome back to Strange Planet, my friend. How are you?
Hey, Richard, I'm doing just fine. Thanks for having me back on Strange Planet. Like I say, you write the best introductions of any host I ever have the opportunity to speak on their show. And if there was ever a strange place on this planet, boy, it would certainly have to be Antarctica.
And as I mentioned, you were there. You didn't rely on secondhand reports or satellite screenshots. What was the very first moment in Antarctica when you realized the official story doesn't match what I'm seeing?
Yeah, I went down there 7 years ago, almost to the day. And I was on coast to coast with you just a week or two prior to getting on the boat. So
That's right.
That was quite an experience, taking a sailboat across the very rough Drake Passage where I got violently ill and seasick. And the first thing we saw, as soon as I was able to recover and get up and do iceberg watch duty, were these giant icebergs with flat tops that had broken off the Fitchner ice shelf and were floating north and gradually melting. So that was my first impression, but then we dropped anchor on King George Island and went to a Polish base there because we had 11 Poles on our sailboat, 3 Americans. We brought them some fresh fruit and vegetables, and they invited us in to have a shower, which can't tell you how good that felt. And to just stand on terra firma and check our email, let everybody know we made it down there safely. So that was the first impression of the ice continent, and it is very much a frozen landscape covered in perpetual ice.
So let's talk about ancient maps, one in particular, the Perry-Rees map, which appears to show Antarctica ice-free, something mainstream history says should be impossible. First of all, tell us a little bit, give us some background on the Perry-Rees map. Where was it? Who put it together? When was it uncovered, and so forth?
Sure. And I have images of it in my book, Secrets of Antarctica. I'll just pull up images, whatever we're talking about. Here is the Perry-Rees map. Mm-hmm. This was drawn in the year 1513 by a Turkish admiral on gazelle skin. And as he said, it shows the bottom portion of the map. Here's a blow up of Antarctica, or what land mass would be there. Mm-hmm. And it has animals and some other kind of flora that are growing there, things that would not be able to live there this day. So to see them on this map, it suggests two things. One, Perry-Rees has drawn from source maps that were very, very old at a time when Antarctica didn't have any ice on it where it could support this kind of megafauna and megaflora, or two, that those source maps that he drew from, which he even says on the liner notes, that come from the Library of Alexandria all the way back to Ptolemaic times of the ancient Greeks, that they had sailed down there themselves and had charted out this landscape. And, you know, what's really interesting about the Piri-Reis map is that the Fitchner ice shelf, which is depicted free of ice on this map, has islands in it that weren't known until recently when they started doing sonar scans and then found that they really did exist and almost in the exact same dimensions that are depicted on the map.
So if there was a time in fairly recent history, I mean, we're only talking 550, 560 years ago, if Antarctica was ice-free then, why is that important? What does that change?
Well, for one, it would show that mariners of an ancient time had ruled the seas and knew their way around and were charting this out. Because the very first people to set foot in Antarctica were the whalers and the sealers in 1821. So this map predates it by 3 centuries, but suggests that the original explorations took place much, much earlier.
So moving ahead to the 1930s, we had the Nazis. We had Nazi activity in Antarctica. This is something that's often sort of dismissed as fringe. Yet the historical record confirms German expeditions. There were territorial claims. I believe there was some missing personnel. They lost some personnel down there. Tell me about these expeditions to the Antarctic by the Third Reich.
And I'm glad you say expeditions in the plural, because there were more than one. The very famous one was the New Schwabenland expedition, when they made the claim to the land of New Schwabenland, which on maps is called Queen Maud Land or Dronning Maud Land. Dronning is the Norwegian word for queen. And they had claimed that same territory. But the Germans came in with a lot of military hardware and laid their claim and dropped these 2-meter long flags that mounted themselves in the snow. And to them, that was their idea of making a land claim here. And the very first expedition that's known is the New Schwabenland. The Schwabenland was a ship that went down there, and they set up base 211, or point 211, it's sometimes called, because it's like our Area 51. It's just a designation on a map of a certain region. So that's why we know pretty close to where that base 211 was, which was near the Schumacher Ponds, this Arctic oasis that never freezes. And it has these lakes that are geothermically heated, much like the whole continent, which has 14 known active volcanoes and 93 geothermal features. So it's the most volcanically active continent in the world.
And why there? Why did the Germans why did the Nazis, I should say, plant their flags there specifically?
Well, I suspect it was for that geothermal heat, because then you have an energy source and then you have a way to stay warm, say under the ice or in the forts. You know, geothermal energy is quite common where you have heated areas. In fact, the valley I live in here in Nevada, we have the oldest geothermal plant in the state of Nevada, because there are all kinds of hot springs around here. And so then they would just be tapping into a free energy source. And why wouldn't you? But I think there's more to it, Richard. And I think that they got under the ice near those Schumacher Ponds and followed some of these ice caves and found an area where they could also exist below the ice.
Are there any written records to suggest that they were creating a base under the ice?
Well, there is the 211 documentation, and they also spoke of building another larger, much larger city called the New Berlin base, or the New Berlin Science City, as Captain Mark Richards describes it. And there is even a book that came out about 5-7 years ago that Carrie Cassidy at Camelot got. It was all written in German, but they interpreted it. It was Life in the New Berlin base. And the guy starts out by describing his life in a perpetual under ice dome, and then eventually he makes his way out and migrates to Germany, and he writes his book.
Yeah, it seems to me, if I'm remembering correctly, and it was probably you that brought this to my attention, that there were essentially female slaves that were taken to this base, and they were basically producing, I guess they're called Lebensborn children down there. Yeah. Is that correct?
So yeah, and Lebensreich means the ability to spread out. And the Germans needed colonial land. They really weren't much of a colonial power like the other European countries. They only took Namibia and Southern Africa and around Somalia, and those colonies never really produced much. So at the end of World War II, when they were in perpetual retreat mode after 1943, they did acquire thousands of Ukrainian women to accompany those male scientists and other soldiers that were heading down there on a one-way trip. And there are even letters home and other documentation that these people, even the Germans, knew that it was a one-way trip. And they were specifically scouting orphans or people that would leave the fatherland behind and set up a new life down there. I have in the book a speech given by Hitler where they were saying that they wanted to specifically recruit these kind of people for this territory down there. And this to me is it's called the conscript, and it's this order in 1940, October 1st, 1940. So they already were recruiting for this, and they're saying that they're looking for the SS, and they're allowing us to recruit out of the Air Force, the Kriegsmarine, and the Reich Chancellor and units of the SS, a covert selection of volunteers for the deployment of the armed forces to go down to the territories of the German Reich of Antarctica, which are located under the ice of the South Pole. I'm reading this right out of the quote here. And new territories of the German Reich and New Schwabenland, they work on these candidates, take into account that the volunteers will say goodbye to the fatherland forever and will be sent to New Schwabenland for a permanent stay. The measures for resettlement of the best candidates from the ranks of the military and SS must be carried out in strict secrecy. As the person responsible for the Reich resettlement, part of the population of purebred Aryans to New Schwabenland, and for ensuring the secrecy of this action, I appoint Reichsleiter Martin Bormann, the Reich Chancellor. Now, Martin Bormann plays a big role in post-World War II as well, because he was never captured, but he was tried in absentia at the Nuremberg trials, sentenced to death if they ever caught him. He keeps popping up all over South America in the 1950s, and he was the money man. He was the one that got out with many metric tons of gold. And so he's kind of running the show down there throughout the 1950s, and this is what I and other researchers like Jim Marrs called the Fourth Reich. And you can make the argument that it started in Antarctica.
What else were they doing at these bases, Base 211 and New Berlin, under the ice? They weren't just housing, a population. Were they perhaps interacting with a race of aliens down there?
That's the million-dollar question, Richard. And I would say they probably were, based on Admiral Byrd's diary. in which he was the very first to fly over the South Pole in 1929. And I have a map here of his route, which was getting to the South Pole. And you'd think, oh, we made it to the South Pole, fist bump in the air. But no, what he did was he flies about another 150 miles out of his way to take a look at something which happens to be right there in the new fly zone. And here's the map, and there's a blow up. See that little triangle?
Yes.
He gets to the pole, and then he goes a little extra ways. Turns out that triangle is the exact location of the no-fly zone over the South Pole. So, and this is also where Brian S., the whistleblower of Linda Moulton Howe, also places the hole in the ice, which he personally saw. And I had the great opportunity of interviewing him last year when I was working on this book and asking him about this giant hole in the ice, which is several miles wide, large enough that you could comfortably feel like you could fly down in an airplane and then turn around and make it back out. And Brian S.'s map also shows that hole in the ice exactly where this no-fly zone is, in the same area where Byrd flew over this quadrant of the South Pole area. So that's the good evidence. And then also what has come out of Russia in the Soviet Union days. And here's a map of the clean air sector. That's the cover story, Brian S. says, was why they have a no-fly zone, also a no-travel zone. Even on the ground, you can't even go there. And so the excuse is, oh, well, it's for keeping the air clean. This is Brian S.'s map with the hole in the ice. All of them correspond right to that no-fly zone, which Brian S. says the clean air zone was just a cover story. There's no radar equipment, no buildings, no measuring equipment. But there is a road that leads from the South Pole base with snowmobile tracks and snowcats that gets to the hole. And Brian S. was describing this to me, and the whole crew saw it. There's a road that corkscrews down the hole, so you can actually access it by road, which is just remarkable to me.
And this area is also, there's no satellite imagery of this. It's also obscured by clouds, or supposedly they're clouds, right?
Well, and I've loved Google Earth. I've scoured the entire continent many, many times, but find that they put these little overlays, sometimes really sloppily, not even really trying too hard to blend in the landscape. So there are certainly places that are no sea zones too.
And how far is that opening, presumably into the interior of the Earth? How far is that from either the Base 211 or New Berlin?
Good question. So the polar plateau is over 2 miles thick of solid ice. So up on the surface at the Amundsen-Scott South Pole Research Station, a big problem is static electricity because it's so dry there and such high elevation. They're at about 11,000 feet elevation where the base is. So if we can presume that the hole acts as sort of like a chimney for the hot air that's created in the geothermal vents, that it goes all the way down to the continental level, 2 miles down. And so you could fly in, you can drive in, and then we also did some calculations on Google Earth with the German specs, and you can take a submarine to within 100 miles of the South Pole. So this is where we think the New Berlin base was located, because in that ComSpec that I just read, he even says it's at the South Pole. So everything points to the southern proximity of the planet, which is also this very highly enforced no-fly zone. Because on the way back from this emergency delivery of a person who was going to die, that's why they defied the no-fly zone and flew over it. Brian S. says on the way back, they're going to go take another look. And when they were getting close to the no-fly zone perimeter, over the radio comes someone that says, "Don't go there. Why are you flying off course?" So they had to veer back to the regular course, fly around the no-fly zone. And when they landed at South Pole, they were read the riot act and basically told, "You didn't see what you just saw, and don't tell anybody about it." So there's something that's being hid there for sure.
Right. But Admiral Byrd defied the no-fly zone. He flew over it, said it was large enough he could have flown into it. Didn't he, in fact, fly into it?
So that was the second trip he did, and it wasn't a no-fly zone until the last few decades. So when Byrd discovered it in 1929, he was the very first aviator, probably the first surface human to ever see it, because the other two parties, the Scott Party and the Amundsen Party, reached it in 2013 or 1913, but they're coming from the opposite direction, so they wouldn't have seen it about 50, 60 miles away from South Pole. Byrd saw it, and then when he came back another Antarctica trip in 1946, at the very beginning of Operation Highjump, he flew back there. And I think with the intention of going down into the hole. And that's when he had the very famous 3 hours of missing time on his flight. Now, Richard, how do you have enough gas to just do circles around the South Pole for 3 hours? That's virtually impossible. So he must have landed somewhere. And according to the last survivor of Highjump, his name's Robert Johnson. He just did some interviews before he passed a couple of years ago. He said that he was there when Byrd came back, visibly shaken, wouldn't talk about it, and wouldn't even fill out a flight log. So he was pretty much a very stable guy and in really good shape. But something really shook him up on that trip, the second trip.
We want to talk about Highjump in a moment here, but before we do that, just a couple more notes on Byrd. What about this alleged secret diary that I think was published by his son? There's some question as to whether it's legitimate or not, but in this diary, he talks about, I don't know how this was maybe recovered memory for this 3 hours of missing time, but he claims he was basically escorted into the interior of the earth. It was just this verdant, almost paradise with huge mammals, and then met with, ascended masters or something like that?
Yep, and this is the cover of the book, The Secret Diary of Admiral Richard E. Byrd, a secret expedition and journey to a paradise inside the earth. Now, it's really interesting in the book, though, Richard. The son found it, and his nephew published it. But they published it by saying that everything was in the Arctic, the North Pole region. But the dates given was exactly when Byrd was in the Antarctic with Highjump. And the other thing is, you wouldn't do a flight in that time of year, which is summer in the Antarctic, perfect time, but pitch darkness in the Arctic. So I think that's just a cover part of the gag order that him and his son, who was actually a young Navy guy who accompanied his father to Highjump. And he also died under very mysterious causes when he was going to Washington, D.C. to give a talk about his father's exploits down in Antarctica. He just went missing off a train and found a month later in a Baltimore warehouse. Richard E. Byrd III. And so everybody who gets close to this stuff dies under mysterious causes, including a James Forrestal, who was, they say was the first casualty of the UFO cover-up. And him and Byrd were very close friends. And I've got a picture of Byrd coming back from Antarctica and then presenting to his friend Forrestal a stuffed penguin. And he must have told him everything, because only a few weeks later, there's Forrestal getting the penguin from Byrd. And only a few weeks later, James Forrestal is walking the halls of the Pentagon going, "There are UFOs in Antarctica. Did not defeat the Nazis. We don't know what to do about it." And then Truman says, "Get him out of here." He was a Secretary of Defense. They committed him to Bethesda, where he was suicided out the window of the top floor. Wow. So people run into misfortune every time they get a little too close to the truth down there.
So again, the diary, this is Byrd talking about what he saw when he flew into the interior of the Earth, correct?
Yes, that's correct. So it starts out with him reading the meters and basically getting to this land with verdant green hills. So I take this to be the continental area of the continent. And I can't explain how there could be green verdant valleys down there, nor how they said they saw a woolly mammoth. And eventually, that's when they lose contact with Little America. The radio goes out, and then two Flugerods, or UFOs, come wingtip to wingtip. And over the radio is a Germanic voice that says, "Hello, Admiral Byrd. You're in good hands. We will be landing you in the domain shortly." And they landed like a helicopter. In no way would a plane ever land like that, but they had some kind of gravity traction device that was able to take control of his plane. And then he went into this emerald city, like the Wizard of Oz is how I describe it. But he said it had pastel colors, and had this meeting with the master, who was telepathic. Because at one point, Byrd asked him, "Why did you want me to come here?" And they said, "Well, you're very well regarded on the surface world." And Byrd thinks to himself, "Surface world, where am I?" And the master says, "You're in the domain of the Ariani," which is a very similar sounding word to the Aryans. So you know that the Nazis were absolutely fascinated with finding their ancient heritage. And so when the meeting was over, he was warned about nuclear weapons, to take this message back to his superiors at the Pentagon. He was escorted out the same way he came, 3 hours later. And the last thing the pilot said to him, said, "You have control of your plane back. Auf Wiedersehen." Goodbye in German.
What ultimately happened to Admiral Byrd?
Well, he did go down a 5th time, and this was in Operation Deep Freeze. And this was to set up permanent bases in Antarctica, including the McMurdo base, the South Pole Station, and Little America got decommissioned. That was no big deal. But also the Palmer base, where I went to visit. And that's the cover story. That's what they said what it was all about. But why go down there with a military fleet again? Captain Mark Richards, who is a whistleblower with Kerry Cassidy on Project Camelot, I bought his book about Operation Highjump. And he said that the Americans, all they wanted was one of these anti-gravity craft. In fact, that's what Highjump was all about, was to capture one of these crafts, which they didn't. It was a big one-sided rout, which is depicted on the cover of the book here. But they landed one of the crafts on a ship during Operation Deep Freeze, which took it right back to the States. And then Byrd comes back, and he does this interview on Longines radio. And he kept talking about this land beyond the poles, which doesn't really make any sense because it's this polar plateau, hundreds of miles in all directions, just a big ice sheet. But he kept saying that this would be the place where young explorers could find new lands beyond the pole. Well, Richard, he was dead a couple months later of a heart attack in his bed, perfectly great shape, just like James Forrestal, and then like his son at the age of 68, 2 decades later, going to deliver this speech in Washington, D.C.
So, backing up, 1946, Operation Highjump, the Second World War has officially ended by this time. Operation Highjump is supposed to be some sort of a training exercise, but it involved aircraft carriers. There were thousands of troops. So So what happened exactly during Operation Highjump?
So the armada of ships broke up into three groups. Byrd stayed with the main group around Little America, which is not too far away on the other side of the McMurdo Sound from McMurdo Base. While the other two groups, called the East and the West, they went around Antarctica both ways and converged at New Schwabenland. And all the while, they're doing these flights over the continent, surveying it, photographing it. And then one of the two East or West groups had discovered Point 211. So they went back to bomb it, just some outbuildings. I think the large majority of the base was under the ice that they couldn't hit. But when they showed that they were going to hit it with bombs, that's when the Battle of Highjump began. And they took it out on the main group, and craft came up out of the water and out of sea caves. And with one boat, they just sliced it in half with something akin to a direct energy weapon. Of course, that was enough for Byrd to say, okay, we're out of here, and called off the whole expedition, which was supposed to go 6 months, but only after 2 months. And they took it back, and while Byrd was en route back to America, he gave an interview on a newspaper called El Mercurio newspaper, and his direct quote was, Admiral Byrd declared today it was imperative for the United States to initiate immediate defense measures against hostile regions. This is coming back from Antarctica. The Admiral further stated that he didn't want to frighten anyone unduly, but that it was a bitter reality that in case of a new war, the continental United States would be attacked by flying objects which could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. Admiral Byrd repeated the above points of view, resulting from his personal knowledge gathered both at the North and South Poles before a news conference held for International News Service, which was supposed to go out on the wire to all the English-speaking countries, but they killed the story. But the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio did run it.
Was there any evidence that these strange craft, these UFOs that were attacking American ships and American fighter craft down in the Antarctic, that they were somehow working alongside the Nazis, even though the Third Reich had surrendered at the end of the war?
So again, that's a $1 million question. And I don't think anybody really knows who was piloting those craft in the Battle of Highjump. Could it have been the reptilians, which many UFO historians say that the Nazis had allied with in the 1930s to get that technology? And even Herman Oberth, who became a paperclip Nazi at Nassau at his retirement, when asked, how did Germany become so advanced so quickly? He said, well, we had some help from our friends from above, pretty much admitting that they had worked with some kind of alien technology to create their own version of the Honeybu and the Vril and the Andromedan mothership craft. So who piloted those craft during the Battle of Highjump? Could have been the Honeybu, could have been those Flugerods that he saw in the domain of the Ariani, or it could have been a Allied ET race, allied to the Antarctic Germans.
Right. I said the Third Reich surrendered. Actually, the Third Reich never surrendered. The German army surrendered, but the Third Reich never surrendered, which I guess leads to this idea. As you mentioned yourself, the late Jim Marrs talked about the Fourth Reich. So after the Third Reich supposedly is defeated, they've basically, relocated their base of operations to both the Antarctic and then later South America?
That's correct. And while I was in South America, we went and got close to some of the what are known as micronations, according to John Lear, the famous UFO whistleblower who worked for the CIA, and his family created the Lear jet. They created these huge property holdings. And again, Martin Bormann, the money man, he had the ways to buy these huge tracts of land. which are as big as some of our smaller states like Delaware or Connecticut, in Brazil and Argentina and Chile. So they had some of the personnel and materiel went to these micronations, but others went to under the ice to some of these bases in Antarctica, where they continued on for multi-generations. So just recently, Stuart Swerdlow, who's one of the last remaining Montauk boys, he did some interviews with Nino Rodriguez and Dr. Michael Sala, who is a huge resource for me creating this book. And he says he knows someone who's multi-generation out of the Fourth Reich. He even used that term. And they want to come out and tell the world, hey, we're here. We've been doing our thing down here for a couple generations or decades now, but we just don't know how to say it. And we don't think people will take too friendly to the notion that the Fourth Reich has been in existence since the end of World War II.
And do you believe that those two bases, New Berlin and 211, are still essentially operational, and that there's still a population down there, like descendants from pre-war Germany living down there?
I do think there are. And when I was going over maps before my trip, Richard, I might have mentioned this to you when I was on coast right before we went on, that I found these maps of all the military and research bases in Antarctica during the Cold War. West Germany is still there. And then it became unified Germany. The Germans never left. And then I found a third location called the Thule Refuge. And you could see almost all of it is underground with U-boat ports. And I found this location. It's on one of the edges of New Schwabenland. And I would wager to bet that all of these bases were interconnected under the ice, because there are now scans going on of Antarctica, much in the same way they did those scans of the Giza Plateau last year, finding all kinds of things, as well as freshwater lakes that flow out through rivers to the ocean under the ice, and these giant domes, which the geothermal heat would have created, as well as grid-like formations, which look like city grid patterns. And Mother Nature does not create pyramids or grid-like patterns in such perfect form like that. So this is some of the big news that's coming out of Antarctica recently, Richard, is they're finding all kinds of high-tech or maybe ancient civilizations that once lived there.
Satellite imagery or Google Earth imagery appears to show pyramidal structures, geometric formations, as you said, symmetrical anomalies beneath the ice or emerging from the ice. Tell me more about those.
Sure. I've located at least 3 locations where pyramids are even on official maps, and the GPS coordinates, a place called Oatsland, found on Google Earth. Another one, this one is the most famous, in the Ellsworth Range, called the Great Pyramid of Antarctica. And then a third one in the Shackleton Range, which ancient alien star David Hatcher Childress said on Ancient Aliens about this one that there's a distinct possibility that the Shackleton Pyramid is the oldest of its kind on Earth. He said, if this gigantic pyramid in Antarctica is an artificial structure, it would probably be the oldest pyramid on the planet. And in fact, it might be the master pyramid that all other pyramids on planet Earth were designed to look like.
Wow. Remarkable. Remarkable. What else is emerging from the ice in the Antarctic? There's talk about this massive mothership that's coming out of the ice that's attracting the attention of some of the world's elites.
Yeah, it sure is. So I remember in 2016, 2017, you had all the elite going down there, and they were John Kerry on election day 2016 in November. He goes down there. he goes flying inland somewhere for about a week. Nobody knows where he went, but presumably to some under ice base. And then you have the second man to walk on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, who puts out this cryptic tweet that he's seen the face of evil and that we're all in danger. And then other people from King Carlos of Spain and even famous movie stars like Tom Hanks and such were going down there. Maybe they were going to see one of these craft under the ice. There's actually supposed to be 3 of them, which got the nickname Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. This is one which is in the New Schwabenland region at a German base called the Conan base. And I give the GPS coordinates. People want to look it up. I just looked it up a few months ago. And you go on the Wayback Machine to 2013, they're doing some kind of excavation. Another one is what Spartan 1 told Linda Moulton Howe was this giant octagonal-shaped craft partially submerged under the ice, in which he was able to get in there. And there's all these hieroglyphs, including a glyph of the Black Sun, which is the deepest occultic symbol of the Nazi Germany and the SS. And by the way, the SS never surrendered after World War II either. And they were like the elite corps, the last battalion that Hitler spoke about in one of his last speeches, that they would be the ones that carry on the tradition. And so one of these 3 are probably the Illuminati Disneyland, as it's called, or they're going to the hole in the ice, because Prince Harry went there also in that time frame with a bunch of his army buddies, and they went cross-country skiing across the polar plateau from the South Pole base for a week. And again, what are you supposed to see on a giant slab of ice in very inhospitable conditions unless they got permission to go to the hole in the ice?
Didn't someone hack into their... Everyone back then was wearing those, what are they called, Fitbits, those wristbands that measure your physical activity, and someone hacked into those and were able to establish that all of these people, including, you mentioned, Prince Harry, were in this, gathered around this one specific location, which happens to be where one of these craft are emerging from the ice?
Yeah, that happens to be the Union Glacier. But sometimes we can put a bookend on some of these conspiracies, because I talked to a person who does custom trips down there for Antarctic Logistics Expeditions, ALE. And I went to their office in Punta Arenas, Chile, and also another office in Utah, and talked to their logistics manager and showed him all my pictures, including the pyramid, which he just called a nunatak, which he just says is an attractive four-sided pyramidal mountain poking through the ice. I said, what about all these Fitbit? And he said, oh, that's at Union Glacier, and we land there. And I said, how come all these people are doing like this similar walkthrough? And he says, oh, well, we had to wait for about a week for some weather to clear. And so we did, to keep everybody in shape, we did like a little triathlon marathon. So on the surface, it looks like they're exploring something under the ice or going around an old craft. But sometimes the simplest explanation is the easiest, and that was all at Union Glacier.
Well, assuming this person is telling the truth.
Sure.
So getting back to the Second World War, there was a lot of treasures that escaped Europe. They call it Nazi plunder. Incredibly priceless artifacts, art pieces, gold, you name it, disappeared from Europe, some of which has been recovered, some never recovered. In your estimation, was much of that Nazi plunder taken down to these secret bases aboard German U-boats?
Oh, yeah. Not only are priceless artifacts from several European museums never been recovered, but as I mentioned, many metric tons of gold and other wealth that was brought down there, and then also to these micronations in South America. But the most intriguing artifact of all was the Spear of Destiny. When Adolf Hitler took Austria. This is him looking at it in the Habsburg Museum in Vienna, Austria. He was absolutely mesmerized, and he realized that he had established the essential connection between the Holy Grail and the Spear of Destiny. This was a union in Wagner's last opera called Parsifal, where the Spear of Destiny and the Grail chalices as sexual objects were essential to the eventual consummation of the drama. And so the cup symbolizes the purity and perfection of the Aryan womb, and the spear symbolizes the phallus. And so when Hitler got that, this is part of the reason they named it the Third Reich, because the First Reich was Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire, about 1,000 years prior. He had it. And then the Second Reich, von Hindenburg, he had it in the 19th century. And then when Hitler got it, he says, we're going to create the 1,000-year Reich. He knew immediately that this was an important moment in his life. He stood there gazing at the Spear of Destiny for several minutes, quite oblivious to the scene around me. So at the end of the war, the Allies found it, some of Patton's troops, but it was too easy. Like they just gave it up. They think that was the replica, and the real Spear of Destiny made its way down to Antarctica, where it remains today and where it gives the protection to the Fourth Reich.
Fascinating. Hitler, long rumored to have survived the Fuhrer bunker. The remains that were supposed to be Hitler, turns out, I believe there was DNA performed in the former Soviet Union. They discovered the remains were actually female. That was not Hitler. Supposedly survived. Was he also taken down to the Antarctic aboard a U-boat after the war?
Yeah, he sure was. There's a great History Channel show called Hunting Hitler that went for 3 seasons, 40 or so episodes. And they went to a lot of the places that I went to as well, and all the while making the case that he faked his own death. Like you said, the Russians had a skull that they said was recovered from the bunker in Berlin, turned out to be a female. So that's been completely debunked. They never found Martin Bormann, and they caught Adolf Eichmann down there. He was smuggled out to Israel, put on trial, and executed. But there are so many other of these escaped Nazis that just started a new life down there, and Hitler was one of them. So he would have gone to the impregnable fortress that the U-boat fleet created for the Fuhrer, is what Admiral Byrd said in 1943. But I think he wanted to be in a place like Bavaria at Berchtesgaden, where he had the eagle's nest. So I went to Bariloche and got as close as I could to the Inalco house. And this is one of his safe houses right near Bariloche, that in Hunting Hitler, they went ashore with a boat and explored around and found that there was an underground bunker there because there were stovepipes sticking out. But they also found the hangar where a seaplane could pull out into the lake and fly over the crest of the Andes in a hurry to move the Fuhrer. And it said that he had lived out his natural life. He had safe houses all around South America and died in Paraguay and was buried under a hotel in Asunción, the capital of Paraguay, and it still remains a secret to this day. When I was down there, though, Richard, right before I left South America, a big story broke that they found this huge cache of Nazi artifacts, really rare and valuable Nazi artifacts, and somebody had a false wall. And it was a big news story when they found thousands of these artifacts. So there were a lot of Nazi sympathizers down there. They lived all over the place, and they were the wealthiest South Americans. In fact, there was a joke I heard when the Argentinians and the Chileans, they pretty much wiped out all their indigenous people. There's only about 1% left. and they're kind of going through an existential crisis. Who are we as Chileans or Argentinians? And they're mostly Southern European immigrants. So the joke is, well, we're Italians who speak Spanish and wish we were as rich as the Germans.
The Antarctic Treaty, it's been sold to us as this peace agreement, and that the Antarctic belongs to no one. Yet, as you've pointed out, access there is so tightly controlled, enforcement is absolute. I mean, if Antarctica truly belongs to everyone or to no one, why does it behave so much like it's owned by someone very powerful?
Yeah. And I think this is really the answer to Byrd leaving with one of the UFOs that they wanted so bad after Operation Deep Freeze. And then there was also the very secretive atomic bomb test called Operation Argus in 1958. We go down there with a whole bunch of ships right off the coast of New Schwabenland in the Southern Ocean, and we're testing nuclear bombs in the upper atmosphere. That's the cover story. I think it could have been retaliation for Highjump, or maybe they were a little pissed off that the Germans didn't give them a good enough UFO or whatever. But right after Argus, 1959, you have the Antarctica Treaty being formulated. And one of the very first provisions is that no nuclear bomb testing or explosive devices will ever be allowed in Antarctica. They make such a high priority of making that one of the top priorities as if it already happened. And so the Antarctica Treaty holds to this day. And some of the provisions are that the whole continent would be reserved for science, and it's like a giant biosphere park for the whole world. But even tourism is allowed in the Antarctica Treaty, and my trip down there is a testament to that. But what it also did was create some of these no-fly and no-go zones. And I think it was at the behest of the Antarctica Germans, who don't like the term Nazi, by the way. They prefer to be known as the Antarctic Germans, to say, hey, we got our areas, you leave us alone, and do your research bases just elsewhere. Because it's a huge continent. There's so much room for everybody. They don't need to really be in these areas that are sensitive.
I mean, ultimately, is the world totally under control of the Fourth Reich? Is the United States under control of the Fourth Reich?
Well, this is The Untold History is the subtitle here of The Ice Continent. This is as much a history book as it is all the weird anomalies of Antarctica as well, because the untold history is they did start a Fourth Reich. And you have institutions like the World Economic Forum, the Bank for International Settlements, where, by the way, Klaus Schwab and Christine Lagarde of the IMF both went down to Rothschild Island a couple years ago, presumably to get their marching orders. So there are places down there that could still be calling the shots. And then you have all these institutions that nobody really likes or wants anything to do with, but are pushing this fascist agenda. And I love this meme that came out that says, Allies, we defeated the Nazis. And then the Nazis, Werner von Braun, head of NASA, Walter Hallstein, head of the EU Commission, Adolf Hessinger, NATO's chief of staff, Kurt Waldheim, Secretary General of the United Nations. So there you have it. I mean, they've been around this whole time, but just under the radar to no one to suspect that the Fourth Reich has been operating as an intelligence operation and a financial operation ever since.
Is there any chance that, I mean, obviously you're bringing this to the world's attention, but do you think we'll ever officially understand what's going on down there?
I sure hope so, Richard. And I've even put it out there that I would like to go down there because I know a lot of these locations, if we could put together a trip with a film crew. But I say on the back of the book, all roads lead to Antarctica. Of course, there are no roads that lead to Antarctica, but I think all roads in this disclosure field, they all have a connection with this mysterious ice continent down there. And if anything, like, say, one of the 3 giant motherships becomes known to the world, or if they're allowing people to go down that road that corkscrews down the hole in the ice, to anything from more whistleblowers coming out saying, we grew up in the New Berlin base. Our parents and grandparents came down here in the 1940s, and we want the world to know that we're here and we exist and we're not hostile and we just want to be a part of the world community again.
Secrets of Antarctica. How do we get a copy?
Well, you can get a signed copy at cccpublishing.com. And of course, it's available at bookstores everywhere. If they don't have it, they can order it and get it through our distributor, or can find it on any of the online retailers as well.
Fantastic. Brad, it's an amazing, amazing accomplishment pulling this all together. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, as always.
Oh, geez, Richard. Always my pleasure to talk with you. Thanks for having me on Strange Planet.
You got it.
We talked about the strangest of planets here today.
Indeed.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.